Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video, so please feel free to hit those buttons. And feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. Not really into this for the money. I'm into this because I realize that there are other people asking the question, why should I trust Christianity? Why would somebody deconvert? Why would anybody do those things? So, it's more about me having a soapbox, I guess, than anything else. So you'll just have to live with it. I started this series with an introduction, calling it the Tal Tale of Jesus. It is still subtitled a Skeptic's Disharmony of the Gospels. It's just that I can't always fit that into the title of a video, so I'm just going to keep it the Tal Tale of Jesus introduction, and we're going to talk about the canonical Gospels. I will probably get into the canonization process next week, or maybe Wednesday, I'm not sure yet, but I will hit that issue because I'm going to talk about the other non-canonical gospels. But canonical means basically that these are the four recognized gospels that are in the Bible, recognized by the church. If you go to most majority Christian churches, you will find these four gospels listed, and they are Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I am going to basically go over some of my thoughts about each of the gospels today. And I'm going to start talking about my criteria of judging those gospels in their accounts as whether those accounts are historical or not. Because that's really the issue, isn't it? The issue with what I'm saying here with the title of my series here, The Tal Tale of Jesus, is that it's not a historical story. It's a tall tale. I'm making a very definite assertion, a very definite claim here that this is not something that is historical, but rather there's an element of historical truth to it, but a lot of it is just straight up historical fiction. My personal belief is I do believe that there was a Jesus of Nazareth. I just think over the years, the story, the tall tale, got blown out of proportion. It has all the air markings of a legend and building a legend. Especially when you get to the later non-canonical gospels that get rejected. When you look at some of them, that Jesus has become a character of fictional literature that has gone off the chain. And what we see in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John is what the church, the council at the time, decided these were the authoritative accounts of Jesus's life. They made no real sense of whether they were historical or not. It was more about them being authority. So one of the other things I want to mention here is I am going to concede a lot of things to conservative Christian scholarship. And one of the things that I'm going to concede is regarding these Gospels, is I'm going to take the conservative viewpoint of when they were written. I'm also going to take the conservative view of authorship. But in this video, I want to tell you a few things about all four Gospels that are true. Number one, it is much more likely that they were written later than what conservative scholarship says. Conservatives that want to make the Bible true and make it history put a lot of these Gospels in the first century. And while I would say that maybe that's possibly true, I would also say that it's probably later in the first century, like 90 AD or later. So we're talking, in my personal opinion, I think a lot of these were written later. But I'm going to say, forget all that. Let's give the devil their due, so to speak, and say, okay, let's say the conservatives are right. Let's say Mark did indeed write in 45 AD or so. Let's say that Matthew did write in 58 to 60 AD. And Luke wrote in like 62, 63 AD, and then John writes in 90 AD. And that's the order that they're written in. Let's assume that that is true. And we're going to approach each of these Gospels as if those things are true, that the dating is correct. I'm also going to assume that the authorship that is believed is true. Now, I want to, once again, not one of these Gospels has the name of the author presented in it. It is assumed. The best argument I've heard from this, I think Bart Ehrman made the case that there was no way that these could have been written by who everybody supposed they'd written. The argument that I heard that was counter, that was probably the best argument in defense of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John being the actual writers, is that the tradition of these Gospels being read with that authorship is very early. Like, it appears almost immediately. There's no, if you have the Gospel of Mark in, say, Spain and Turkey, what we would call Turkey back then, they would call Asia Minor. If you have the Gospel in both of Mark in both those places, the text, it's called the Gospel of Mark in Turkey and in Spain at that point by the 2nd century. But all that really proves ultimately is that the tradition that these were written by these particular men was true, was established very early. That's all you really get, is that the church, a good chunk of the church, had established early that these were the writers. But it doesn't give us any hard evidence. It's still pretty conjecture. And once again, the dating of the Gospels is a questionable thing. But you know what? I'm going to give it to them. So we're going to assume that Mark was indeed written by John Mark, who was one of the 70 disciples, according to many people. One story has, if you remember in the story of Mark, I believe there's a passage in the Garden of Gethsemane where a young man is grabbed, and he flees by fleeing naked, leaving his coat behind. This is the guy, Mark, John Mark, that a lot of people think that that's his. We're going to assume that Matthew is written by Matthew the tax collector, who was also one of the 12. We are going to also, in this series, The Tal Tale of Jesus, assume that Luke, the beloved physician, the companion of Paul the apostle, and somebody who knew some of the, supposedly knew, like Peter and some of the other apostles, is also written by Luke, and that Luke really is volume 1 of a 2-volume set, the other second volume being the book of Acts. I think that's pretty well established. Whoever wrote Luke and Acts, the definite style of writing is the same. There's definitely a connection there. So somebody did write both Luke and the book of Acts, I think, and it was probably the same author. But it's still, you're still dealing with a pretty late date. And then we're going to assume that John is indeed written by the disciple whom Jesus loved, because John never identifies himself and never talks about John the apostle either. So it's assumed that the disciple whom Jesus loved is John and the writer of the book of John. I think every one of those could be genuinely disputed because nobody identifies themselves. Nobody really engages that issue so much because people don't want to point out the obvious, which is none of these gospel writers identify themselves. It's assumed by church tradition. And I always have found it amusing that anti-Catholics, for instance, will decry every tradition of the church except this one, that these are the traditional gospels written by traditional people. I'm going to assume that all that is true. I'm also going to go and assume that these men basically participated in a process that created and grew the legend of Jesus, and that their accounts are not necessarily written for historical accuracy. Even when I was in conservative scholarship, we talked about the purpose of each of the Gospels. Mark, for instance, is written to a very Gentile Roman audience, it was believed. That's what, when I took Life of Christ in Bible college, this was kind of one of the discussions. And so Mark was written to the Romans, written to the Greeks, and that's why it's written in Greek, and so on and so forth. And so Mark's Jesus is very active. He calls himself the Son of Man. He's very much about movement and preaching the gospel and doing his thing. Mark, in my opinion, is one of the best pieces of literature regarding Jesus's life. It is also the one with the least amount of miracles. It is also the account of Jesus that has no resurrection story and no birth narrative. It has neither. It starts out with the ministry of John the Baptist, and it ends with an empty tomb, but no statement about how the tomb got empty. Then you have Matthew, the tax collector. Matthew has a genealogy. It doesn't explain as many of the Jewish customs as Mark and Luke and John will. And you really have this idea that Matthew is writing as an apologist to the Jews, saying, hey, Jesus Christ was the Messiah that you missed. He seems to be more addressing the Jewish audience and what their concerns would be, which is why he has the genealogy that traces, oddly enough, through Joseph and David all the way back to Adam, thus proving that Jesus fulfilled a lot of prophecies. I will say this about Matthew. Of all of them, he tries to emphasize the fulfilled prophecies a lot more. The real problem you have is if you look at where those prophecies come from, Matthew plays very fast and loose with those prophecies. He's not really looking at the context of those prophecies at all. And most of the gospel writers don't. And it's one of the issues that's going to come up as I go through each section of my disharmony of the gospels and point out that these writers are really yanking the context, the verse right out of its context, and giving it a whole new meaning that was probably not intended by the original author. But Matthew has a resurrection story. He has a lot of attacks on the Jewish leadership. It's in Matthew that the idea that the disciples stole the body, but that wasn't true. It was made up by the Sanhedrin and the Romans to cover this up, a cover-up story. You have in Matthew probably one of the clearest, longest teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. You have a few more miracles. You have Jesus acting very much as the decisive Messiah that the Jews were looking for. Luke is a little bit different. Luke seems to, the preamble of Luke is, I'm here to set out an orderly account of Jesus's life. When I was in Bible college, we called Luke the true historian of Jesus's life because he wasn't necessarily addressing any particular group of people. He was just trying to get the facts and lay them out. The problem with Luke's history, and you'd say Luke seems to, but he contradicts some of the things said in Mark and Matthew. He also creates interesting historical problems for Mark and Matthew because particularly with the birth narrative in Matthew and Luke are very different. The movements of Jesus and Joseph and Mary are very different. There's just a whole packle of other things. The genealogy is different. There's a lot of differences, but there's also some similarities between Matthew and Luke, which has caused some people to posit that they had another source that both of them utilized besides Mark. It's pretty clear that they also use Mark as well, because a lot of what they write lines up with Mark perfectly. And, whether or not Luke used Matthew as part of the guide is debatable, or some people put Luke before Matthew and say it's the other way around. And they sit there and talk about this debate. But to be honest, we don't have really any clear statement about who used what. We're kind of speculating as scholars. Then we come to John. John's Jesus he's kick-ass. He is like superhuman. He does all kinds of things that the other Gospels don't really record. John is famous for his I am sayings, which don't appear in the other Gospels. There's a lot of new material in John. But this also brings up another problem with John. There's also a lot of uncollaborated material in John. John's the only one that has this stuff. And this kind of leads and segues into my next and final point before I close this video out, is that according to the Old Testament law, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact shall be established for a legal case. The problem is with the Gospels, a lot of people say, well, there's 4 Gospels, so therefore, there's plenty of witnesses that Jesus Christ was, and they uphold and collaborate each other. No, they don't. There's parts of the Bible that certain authors, they're the only one covering it. And then I'm going to look a little bit deeper into this 2 or 3 witnesses thing, because even with Luke, somebody who's proclaimed to be an historian, there are some passages you would have to ask the question, well, who the hell knew this story? Who saw this happen and reported it to Luke? I mean, right out the gate, you have Zacharias in the temple, and the only one that's allowed to go in the temple is the priest. So the only one that could have told the story of what happened with Zacharias and the angel and how he lost his voice until his son was born would have been Zacharias himself. He was the only one that was in there. And so we have one witness testifying to Luke, this is what happened. Luke is not a direct witness in this case. He's a historian, and most historians aren't direct witnesses to events. They're rather write about them after the fact. So you need to realize that that's true with all the Gospels. All the Gospels are written after the fact, and they're written based usually on the eyewitness testimony of others, supposedly. But when we really look at who witnessed the events, it's often one person. This is also true when the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she's a virgin and going to conceive a child. The only one who actually witnesses this event is Mary. She doesn't actually have any other witnesses. This is why, you have to kind of take that story purely on faith. It doesn't even follow the biblical line of credibility of whether or not there are 2 or 3 witnesses. And this is also the reason, actually, that I put Luke as third. I think this edition of the story of Mary seems to be and it comes all of a sudden, because in Matthew, everything's focused on Joseph and his reaction to being the father of the Messiah. In Luke, we suddenly switch over to Mary. And I think the question became, even before the ink was dry on Matthew, well, what the hell happened with Mary? How do we know Mary is telling the truth? And so Luke writes his gospel, and supposedly that makes it true because we've written it down. My problem with Luke is that a lot of his accounts do stand alone, but when you really look at the accounts, there's really only one account. There's only one person say so that this is happening. And then you have John. And John, because he adds so much new material, he is not collaborated by the other 3 Gospels at all. There are certain things that happen in John nowhere else. And John is famous for one story, the woman caught in adultery, but that's an addition to John. Okay, we know it's an addition added on later. And so the early Christians didn't really have the notion that these 4 Gospels couldn't be edited. Mark is obviously edited later. Matthew is edited. Luke has additions and editings to it, and so does John. So how much of this witness is actual witness, and how much of it goes back to people's wishful thinking? Well, that's a really damn good question. To be honest, most of what we're going to see as I go through these 4 canonical Gospels is that when we really break it down, there really isn't a 2 or 3 witnesses to most anything that happened in Jesus's life. Every once in a while, you'll get an account that was supposedly witnessed by multiple people. The problem is then we end up not really knowing their names. And because the Gospels are written so late, even if I take the early dates, they're written, at best 20 years after the fact. How do we know that they haven't been embellished by quite a bit, that the witnesses haven't embellished the story and it's gotten bigger and bigger? And actually, that's what we're going to see. As we go from as we go from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, you'll see that the story gets bigger. It gets wilder. It gets more off the chain, just like a fish story, just like a tall tale. Well, that's it for this edition of the Tall Tale of Jesus here on the Rabyd Atheist. I want to once again welcome you all to my channel. Comments have a way of influencing and determining the content of Friday's videos, and I will respond to them when I can. You can ask direct questions of any time if you're looking to understand something that's within my realm of expertise, which is basically political science, biblical studies. I have a biblical studies degree, I have a theological studies degree. So in that vein, I'll do the best I can to give you an educated answer, or at least an educated guess. You can also suggest things you'd like me to do. Videos are uploaded Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Sometimes they're a little late because I have to record them when I have time. I don't tolerate name calling in the comments section. Just be advised, if you make a comment about somebody's comment, demonstrate that they're not thinking clearly. Don't just call them stupid or a fool. I find that rude and uncalled for, and it shows a lack of emotional maturity, in my opinion. Be sure to like, subscribe, and get your notifications. And hopefully I can someday convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, the Rabid Atheist, saying goodbye and have a great day.